Hello guys, this is Edgar Borges from PopFun TV, today with a very special guest, our very first guest of this new year, Mr. Anton Gill. You don't know this name? But you do surely know Oliver Bowden. Yes, I know you do, but please, Professor Mr. Gill, be welcome to PopFun TV and introduce yourself to our audience, sir, please.
Well, hello. Yes, I'm Anton Gill, also known as Oliver Bowden, and I wrote some of the Assassin's Creed books that go with the games, basically, and they gave me great pleasure. It was enormous fun to do. I can't say I can play the games that well, but I do try. And I very much enjoyed writing them and creating fuller characters for the characters in the games.
That's pretty awesome, sir. But before we enter the Assassin's Creed universe, we have lots of topics to talk about. For instance, how it was for you discovering the habits and the joy, the pleasure of being a writer. How did that ended up in your life?
Okay, well, it was almost an accident. When I left university, I wanted to go into the theatre, and I did spend about 10 years in the theatre, first as an actor and then as a director. But gradually I felt more and more the pull towards writing, and what I decided to do was make that change. And I was very lucky because the first book that came along was a commission, non-fiction, and it was a very serious book. It was about what happens to missing children, how the police investigate when children go missing, and how the families of those children are affected. So I used one case, which at the time, and this is many, many years ago, was a recent case of a little boy who had gone missing on the metro here in London. And it was a very sad story in the end because the little boy has never been found, ever. But to talk to the police, to talk to the family, to get involved with them was a very interesting thing. And only last year, the possibility came up that this little boy, who would now be a man of about 40, 46, had turned up. But sadly for the family, it was a false alarm. From then, I went on to do many, many books, largely non-fiction to begin with, and largely to do with, if you like, contemporary history, particularly European history between the two world wars. So the first, and I think the most important book, was about the lives of people who had survived the German concentration camps during World War II. Not just Jewish survivors, but all kinds of survivors. Political survivors, Jewish political survivors, homosexual survivors, gypsies, people who'd fought in the resistance, all sorts of people. I interviewed 180 people in every European country and in the States, and also, of course, in Israel. I was very sad that I wasn't able to get to South America, but unfortunately with all books, it's a question of time and it's a question of money. So that was the only place I really didn't get to, but I have at least been there as a visitor several times since. And there followed a number of other books, a book about Berlin between the wars, which was kind of political, social, artistic history of the city, which I very much enjoyed. And when it looked as though the writing was on the wall for the end of the Iron Curtain, and it was just about in transition for Eastern Europe, I traveled for very, very many months around all the countries of Eastern Europe, what was then Eastern Europe, which was known, as you know, as the Soviet bloc. And it was a very fascinating time. I mean, if I say that going to Romania in those days was like leaving the planet and going to another planet. It was extraordinary, extraordinary. And I was arrested getting on the plane to fly to Bulgaria. I was arrested by the secret police. Yep. And they took all my notes, they emptied my camera, they took all my film, everything. And it was a hell of a job getting them back, but at least they let me go and they didn't put me into a prison cell for being a spy.
They thought that you were a spy or something like that.
They thought I was something like a spy. They didn't like the beard, and they didn't like the fact that I was a guy traveling on my own. I had a cover. I mean, if I told them I was a writer or a journalist, I would never have got a visa in the first place. So I told them that I was like a school teacher just having a holiday. And when I first encountered the secret police, this was in Romania, I must tell you this story, all the secret policemen in Romania all look the same, whether they are male or female. They all wear blue suits, they're all very fat, and they all have moustaches. This guy sat down next to me and said, they said things like, what do you think of our Mr. Ceausescu, who was the president of Romania at the time? And I would say, oh, Mr. Ceausescu, who's he? What does he do for a living? And pretend to be a complete fool, which is not difficult for me. But they wouldn't know what to say to me, so they would go away. But they must have been watching me all the time, because in the end, they got me. And I did get all my material back a long time afterwards, through the British Foreign Office. So that was okay. Happy ending.
That's your James Bond story.
That's my James Bond story. It wasn't much fun sitting in a cell with various uniformed guys with sunglasses and cigarettes looking in on me occasionally and sneering and then shutting the door again.
It became fun just years later, not at the time.
Oh, yeah, it's funny. It's always true that today's tragedy is tomorrow's joke.
But Mr. Gill, you have already put something very interesting, that every human being has its background, has its own history. And how did you depict that to write your books or to base some characters in real persons?
Well, it's always a long process. What I try to do on the whole is I have the idea, and obviously for every writer it's different. For me, I like to have the idea, and then characters will kind of come into your mind, and they will sort of float around there. And if the idea really takes root in your mind, then they will start to develop and you'll start to think about it. And then I do some quite meticulous planning of how the book will go. And I start, because I've got my cast of characters. However, things can go badly wrong if you plan too much, because I have often been in the situation of reaching a point in the story and I think, hang on, he is going to ask a question at this point. And if he asks the question, then the entire story goes out of the window, because if he asks this question, he will get information which he shouldn't have. And then, of course, the whole idea, the whole plot collapses, and you have to start again. It's a little bit like knitting, and you drop a stitch, and then you have to take the whole pullover apart and start again. And that's not much fun, I must say. But on the whole, and really touch wood, it works. Largely, it has worked for me. And it's always a challenge, and it's different obviously between writing fiction and non-fiction. With non-fiction, I always have done all my own research, all of it. And it's like a tree growing branches and then smaller branches and smaller branches again. You have to make a few contacts to begin with, and then they will introduce you to other people. And then those people, if they like you, will introduce you to other people, and slowly you build up a large number of people to interview about, for example, anything really, like the concentration camp people. I did a biography of the art collector Peggy Guggenheim a few years ago, and that was a challenge because I was asking people about, not about themselves, but to tell me about someone else. And some of the artists I interviewed didn't like that at all. I remember going to New York to interview a very famous and very old woman artist called Louise Bourgeois. And she said, I had made an appointment and everything, and there I was, come to see her. And she said, who are you? Why have you come here? And I said, well, we have an appointment. She said, really? Why have we an appointment? And I felt the ground sinking under me. And I said, well, it's to talk about Peggy Guggenheim. And she said, Peggy Guggenheim? Why do you want to talk about Peggy Guggenheim? Why don't you want to talk about me? So in the end, I got a little bit out of her, but it was not the happiest hour of my life, I must say.
That's pretty interesting, because I was going to talk about that book in specifically, because you have to deal with lots of different people. You have to trace her tree family as well, some relatives and buyers or stuffs like that. And normally on this circle, it's a kind of inner circle that people like to remain in secrecy. They don't like to come in public to deal with interviewers or declarations and stuff like that. What would you say, what advice would you give to our audience, to those who would want to be an investigative writer, and what's the most difficult point on this process?
I think starting is the most difficult point, because you have to find out what to do, and you have to be very, very determined. I mean, what you first have to do is find, perhaps, for example, I can really just tell you about the experience with Peggy Guggenheim. I at first got in touch, the first people I got in touch with were the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation in New York. And its president got in touch with me and was quite friendly. So we had a long telephone conversation, and I could feel that he was checking me out. And he decided that I was okay. So he then put me in touch with one of Peggy Guggenheim's granddaughters, who worked as a curator at the time at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And we then started to talk to each other on a personal basis. And she was extremely helpful. So I made arrangements to meet her in New York and to meet the president of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation. But before I went to New York, they had also put me in touch with the director of the Peggy Guggenheim Museum in Venice. So I had those bits to start with. The next step was really to travel to New York and talk to Carol Vail, Peggy's granddaughter, and to Peter Lawson Johnson, the president of the society. And they started to give me contacts with artists who had worked with Peggy, of course, artists who were by that time very old. And then I was able to follow through, get in touch with those artists, and then interview them. And if they liked me, then they would do a little bit more. But you've got to be very patient. You realize that these people are really quite often very important people, and they're giving you a lot of their time, sometimes hours and hours of their time, for nothing. They're not being paid. There's nothing, they've got nothing really to gain from it. But if you approach them in the right way, and if you show that you're genuinely interested, and you can ask intelligent questions, and you can, flatter them a little bit and ask about them, then you will find that they will respond, and then they will help you find other people to talk to. It was the same with Philip Rylands in Venice. He was enormously enormously helpful, and I got to meet various people in Venice who I wouldn't have been able to contact otherwise, who were then prepared to talk to me, who lived in Venice all their lives, who knew Peggy Guggenheim when she lived there, and were able to give me personal recollections of her. So I would say that was the way to do it. But you do have to be quite patient, and you do have to be prepared to spend quite a lot of time, if you like, laying the groundwork. I think for me, one thing I would say in general, that for me is true, that writing a book is very like Chinese cooking. You make sure that all the ingredients are right and there and ready, and then the cooking itself needn't be too long or too difficult. But if you've got everything prepared, then you're okay. That's a pretty good advice, because my next question follows up this kind of recipe, this advice for cooking. How it was for you receiving this honor and the invitation from Ubisoft team, and how did the Assassin's Creed novels came up to you as a project? Do you remember where you were at the time, how it was on the 2009 year? Yeah, I think I can tell you. I think I can tell you about that. It came about again. It was almost by chance. I had been writing a novel for Penguin Books, and the editor at Penguin Books, who was working with me on that, suddenly came up with this idea and said, "Look, I think you know a fair amount about the Renaissance, history of the Renaissance in Italy." And I did, because it's something it's a hobby. It's like a personal interest. And I said, yes, why? And he said, well, we're looking for somebody to write spin-off books for some computer games, but it's very hush-hush. It's really, you mustn't talk to anybody about it. And I said, okay, well, all right, what is it? And then he said, well, you better come and have a meeting. And so I went to this meeting, and it was just him at that time. And he told me about what was, in fact, the first Assassin's Creed novel called Renaissance. And I thought, well, this sounds absolutely fascinating. So what happened after that was I got in touch with Ubisoft, and it was, they liked me. They liked my track record as a writer, and they thought that I'd be good for this. So that was fine. But we decided to work together. But then every step of the way, it was like you were working in a way like James Bond. Everything was top secret, obviously, because nothing could be leaked. I had to sign all kinds of official secrets acts kind of thing. And that was all fine, and I quite understood it. Then the process of writing was perhaps something else. It was really a specialized thing. And did you felt in any way of the process that you were being watched by trained snipers? Some of the time it felt a bit like that, that's true. But I tried to put that out of my mind. I would try and get I try and get my sort of, my Ezio weapons ready to combat them. That's good. That's good. That's pretty good. So, Mr. Gill, you started with Renaissance. You started already with the Ezio trilogy, one of the most celebrated assassins in the history of the games and books. How it was for you, how it was the feeling of being Ezio for some time, for this trilogy, feeling his emotions, his guilt, his pleasures, and also his burdens as an assassin with such a responsibility over his shoulders. It was quite awesome. It was a completely new thing for me. because in a sense this was a character whom I hadn't created, but the character in the game is not rounded. What my job was to make a real personality out of this character and to create a story which flowed. With the game works on a completely different principle, as you know, from a novel. The game puts your hero in certain situations, and then the game player has to work out how to get him out of those situations or through those situations and onto the next one. And in a sense, it's a repetitive process with increasing degrees of difficulty. And I loved the idea of Assassin's Creed because it was almost like a game of chess. You had to make alliances. You had to borrow money to pay doctors if you were wounded. You had to recognize if somebody was really not your friend, but just pretending to be your friend. All sorts of things like that, which fascinated me. And I thought that was really, really cool and interesting. And I think that one of the other things that worked enormously well for me was getting into the feeling of what it must have been like to have lived, what it must have been like to live in Italy in about 1500, and to have all these different people going around the Renaissance, this exciting artistic movement, exciting scientific movement, and also this extraordinary wheeler-dealing political atmosphere with sort of appalling Borgia popes and God knows what else. And I must say that Ubisoft, or the games developers at Ubisoft, had done amazing background research, fantastically detailed historical research to get everything right and everything authentic. So that was an enormous help. What was difficult, if you like, was getting a narrative line, because in some of the games there's a gap of sometimes years before the next sequence in the game, and you had to bridge those gaps, and you had to introduce characters, and you had to in fact create new situations for these characters. I remember that Ubisoft said, if you invent anything that we subsequently use in a game that we hadn't thought of, then it's ours. Okay, we're not paying you for it, it's ours. That was fine because it was their idea in the first place. But I do remember having to invent, I think it's possibly in Brotherhood, I remember having Leonardo da Vinci invent hand grenades, for example, which they used in a later game. And that was fine, but that was a challenge, always a challenge. And to take real people like Machiavelli or Leonardo da Vinci or Pope Alexander VI and kind of put flesh on the bones, let alone Ezio, who I really loved. I really enjoyed him. I wasn't so keen on Desmond, but Desmond doesn't appear in the books, so that was okay. But Ezio really caught fire with me, and I won't say I would sort of identify with him because, I'm not an athletic freedom fighter aged 26, but the other thing brave about the books was he goes from his 20s to his early 60s. And I thought it was amazing to have a character who actually grows older as the games progress. So in the last one, in Revelations, he's getting a bit of back pain and he can't jump as high as he used to and all that kind of thing. I love that because that's realistic. And I always worked hugely sympathetically with the guys at Ubisoft, and it was great to go and visit their enormous workshop in Montreal. I say workshop, and I'm sure you know, it's an old factory with offices, open plan offices, the size almost of, well, not quite football pitches, but certainly double tennis courts, with all these guys working on aspects of the game. And I thought, this is fantastic. This is really, really something. And I had no idea that a game like that costs more than a feature film to produce. I thought, I'm just a tiny cog in this wheel, but what a privilege to be doing it. And I really loved it.
That's great. That's great because in every book, you kind of like raise your children, your own children, by writing the main character's history. And you began with Ezio, then you came back with Altair, shifting the gear.
That's right.
Let's go from the present to the past and then go forward once again. How it was for you, this kind of subtle changing coming from Ezio with a lot of, technology from the time being and going back to Altair?
That was quite, Altair was a challenge, and I worked in some consultation with other people on that one. One of the problems with the Altair story is that it's much more primitive than the Ezio stories, and it is very, very repetitive. So it was he goes from one situation in one town and has a problem, and then to another place and has another problem, but it's very similar to the problem in the first place, and it repeats. I think they hadn't really got their game programming to as sophisticated as a degree as they very quickly did with the beginnings of the Ezio stories. So writing a novel based on the first game, the prequel, if you like, was really much harder, because there was less groundwork, there was less material, and it didn't develop organically as the other games, I think, do much more. So yes, that was a challenge, and I would say perhaps it didn't work quite as successfully as the other books, because in a sense, when they were great, they gave your writing. Also, this isn't true of the Altair book, because that was a game that was already existed. With the Ezio books, you had to write the book alongside the development of the game so that they could both come out at roughly the same time of year. So I would be sent previews on memory sticks, or the Ubisoft people in Paris, where I was then living, would come and see me with a memory stick, which I would stick in my computer, read it all, and then they'd take it away again. So I had to make notes. I wasn't allowed to keep anything because everything was top secret. And my contract was full of clauses saying, if this leaks out to anybody before the game is released, you will disappear.
There goes the trained snipers once again.
Yeah, absolutely. I was looking over my shoulder a lot of the time that I was writing that first book, I can tell you. But it was hard, because you didn't know. I didn't know what was going to happen next, so you had to be aware, and of course you had to rewrite stuff. And sometimes there would be, for example, obviously they had to read and approve my manuscript when I finally submitted it. And I remember sometimes I went a bit too far. I remember I think it's in Revelations, might be Brotherhood. There's an orgy scene, and I get a little bit too graphic in my description, and they didn't want that because they aimed the books at maybe a slightly younger audience that would not be ready for all that kind of thing, or certainly their parents wouldn't be. I mean, I'm not saying it was pornographic. It was more about the sort of the people being sick and drinking too much and having hangovers. The side of orgies that one doesn't really think about, the nasties, the dark side, if you like. But that was one example. Otherwise, not at all. I was given a pretty free rein. I discussed with the game designers names of characters, because some characters sort of had to be created. And I mean, one character I gave him a name. I described the character as I think I described him as sort of fat and a bit of a slob. Whereas in the game, and I didn't know this yet, the game, he was sort of super handsome and athletic, not unlike you, Edgar. And so my character had to be changed completely.
That's great. That's awesome. I love this kind of stories because it stimulates our audience, your readers, such as me, to know even more and to get us interested even more in reading. And by saying reading, let's talk about another topic. Would you agree, that video games are kind of modern books to our modern audience?
I think you could say that. I think people get very involved in them. They're super sophisticated now. I would hope that it wouldn't stop people from reading. I know that I have a young godson who is completely in that world, but nearly all the time. And he plays games with other gamesters internationally, as they do. And sometimes I think this is great in many ways. He's using thought processes because it's not just a simple game. You have to make decisions. You have to live in that world and survive in that world. And I think that's all very healthy and very good. What I don't think is so good is if that world, the virtual world, replaces the real world. And I think that we may be in some danger of losing really in real life interpersonal skills if we go too far down that road. But somehow I think the human character isn't really going to do that. I think people are always going to keep a balance, or want to keep a balance, because look at this coronavirus thing. What do we all want to do? We want to hug each other. We want to see each other in real life, not on Zooms necessarily. And I think that there can be no replacement for that.
Yeah, that's pretty tough to this whole thing that you have mentioned, and we have lived in this past year of 2020 and entering 2021. I think that this we're going to leave us a mark for our whole lives. And no matter if you are young, if you are old,
I think
everyone is being affected and still being affected to years to come. Mr. Gill, and I would like to have some conversation about Assassin's Creed a bit more, but in a more delightful way. We have seen Ezio, who is one of the most beloved characters, and everything began with Altair. Then you went through some different locations and times, such as American Revolution, to the golden age of the pirates, to the French Revolution, to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in London, and you ended your steps in the desert. How it was for you feeling these different times, different perspectives from the protagonists in each book?
I think what you have to root it back to the fact that these are all avatars, if you like, to a certain extent, of Desmond, so that you've got a running character who can be your anchor.
Mm-hmm.
What is challenging, and must be challenging for my colleagues as much as I, is to put the character, who is essentially the same person, into all kinds of different historical backgrounds, wildly different. They're all very conscientiously researched. The background, the historical background, the look of the game, beautifully and authentically reproduced for the period. I think that you could say that it's quite hard when you, as a writer, have to chop and change from different periods, because you have to immerse yourself in the history of that period almost before you start writing, because you have to understand the period. You have to understand how people were thinking in that period, because obviously they didn't think like we think. There were certain things they couldn't imagine that we take for granted. But at the same time, they were going through things and having emotions that we wouldn't recognize, and living in a world that we wouldn't recognize, a world without electricity, a world where belief in the supernatural was fundamental. You didn't question it. There was a supernatural. You lived in a world where the noises and the smells were completely different. And you had to kind of find a way in your imagination of putting yourself in that situation, all sorts of different situations. And it was always very difficult to do imaginatively. It's very, very difficult to do that, I think. And I think to be honest, I think very few people have succeeded. The historical novel, if you like, is a very difficult thing. People who specialize in them, I think, even some of them don't quite get it. It's very hard. It's very hard for me, for example. I'm sorry to go back to Ezio, who's the character I sort of know best and identify with most. I look at those books now and I think, actually, he sounds too English. He doesn't sound, there are things, reactions, which are just not quite what a young man, a young Italian living 500-600 years ago would have reacted like that. I think I did quite well, but I think no true writer, no true artist would ever feel satisfied with what he'd done. There's always, or she'd done. It's something you always go back and think, oh, if only I could just tweak that a little bit here or do a little bit there. But it doesn't mean you don't do your best in every way, but it is very, very, very hard work.
Mr. Gill, or even better, Anton, as you said before. Assassin's Creed has been normally a saga of male characters, but Ubisoft has introduced her first female protagonist with Evie Frye on the Assassin's Creed Underworld. How it was for you to introduce this female character even before of the female empowered movements?
I think it was something that was.
Don't you think that this should have been a natural movement?
Yes, perhaps it should. I'm dictated to by what Ubisoft decide to do, but I think very early on, I think it's a pity we didn't introduce bigger female characters earlier on. My personal favorite character of all, I think, is Sophia Sartor in Revelations. I really loved her. I loved creating her. I think she's a really gutsy person. And I think that even though in olden days, unfortunately, women didn't get half the credit that was due to them, I think of a huge number of women painters, of women scientists who have been completely ignored in history. And only now, perhaps, people are beginning to realize their contribution. I think in every society that is true. But I suppose in the reality is, if you're going to be true to a time, then women, except for certain very exceptional women who did manage to break the male hold on celebrity, on fame, were unfortunately sidelined. I think it's very important to redress that balance in our day and age. And I think it would be very good if we look back in history to find more important women and actually, if you like, reinstate them, put them in their proper place historically. We hear, of course, there are very many famous aristocratic women or queens, but of ordinary women you hear very, very little. I don't think it's very well known that the very first autobiography ever written was written by a woman, an English woman, in something like, I think, about 1350. I think it's also very important to realize that suddenly women painters who, when they lived, were terribly famous and successful, but they haven't really been looked at seriously for hundreds of years. I'm thinking in particular, because we were talking about the Italian Renaissance, of the Italian woman painter Artemisia Gentileschi, who is now getting an enormous amount of attention. And she was, however, in her time, and she lived from the late 16th century to the middle of the 17th century, she was an enormously successful and rich and very much collected and admired painter in her own right. She was the first woman member of the Academy of Painters in Florence. So I think it is very important that we have women protagonists. I think in a way I mean, I don't know about you, but I've always personally preferred women to men on the whole anyway. I think they're a bit more intelligent. We won't get into politics, but I would really like to have a woman in place of our current Prime Minister. But I think she'd be much more sensible, whoever she was. Anyway, I think my pet dog would be more intelligent than my... Anyway, moving away from that, I hope that's answered your question. It is a challenge, but it's an important thing to not to go overboard, but to make sure, without making it appear condescending or anything like that, just that women take their natural place. They're as good as men, and they've unfortunately historically got the thin end of the wedge, the wrong end of the stick, whatever you want to call it, historically.
Yeah, that's great, and that's pretty important to us to abord to bring this kind of topic and subject to the table, because we're living these strange and dark times nowadays, and women should be respected and treated as our equals in any kind of period, in any period of time. Most important and most of all, right now, nowadays. So, moving forward, you have ended your contribution to the Assassin's Creed saga with this one right here. Assassin's Creed Desert Oath, with the history of the Bayek and the Hidden Ones. How it was for you to saying goodbye with such contributions, such a significant contributions to the Assassin's Creed saga, because you became very famous, much more famous than you already are with these novels, and how it was saying goodbye or so long, see you soon, to these characters and saga.
I think that it's obviously very, very sad when you say goodbye to something that you've been very, very fond of and devoted a lot of time and energy to. But mainly it's sad because it's something that you were fond of. And I think that I can only answer your question by quoting a very famous French actor, Jean-Louis Barrault, who said to me once, feel passion for it all, but cling to nothing. I think it's important always, particularly for any kind of artist, any kind of free spirit, if you like, to move on, never to get in a rut, never to stay with anything for too long. I think it's harder to get out the longer you stay in a place. I know actors who have been many, 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 many years in some soap opera or other, and in a way it's impossible for them to change now because they got used to the money, they got used to the security, but as artists they are trapped. So in a way you always have to think of this not as a door closing or a farewell, but a turning away and saying hello to the next thing. I think one must always, always think like that in life. I think that when somebody asked Victor Hugo what the best days of his life were, he said, the days that are to come. And I think that I would hope to try and live by that myself.
That's pretty significant and something very deep that I can assure you that will stick not only with me, but people who are watching us right now.
Well,
it's pretty good. It's pretty important for us to have these conversations and to bring to them before them much more culture to contribute with knowledge and such topics and subjects. And just to finish, Assassin's Creed, it's not essentially an action genre of boys and girls fighting good and evil. There's a balance, and there's also a hidden message for mankind in any game. They discover throughout the each new chapter of the franchise, there's something more about a previous civilization that led them to evolve technologically, but more deeper, there's a layer that goes for mankind itself. Am I right guessing that? What can you say?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a brilliant summing up of what that game series was about. I think it was a good deal more sophisticated than many others, and I think it's very intelligent, and it does reflect real life. So yes, I couldn't have put it better. So thank you, Edgar. That's a brilliant way of describing the whole series. Brilliant. Thank you.
Now, we are the ones who should say thank you, Mr. Gill, for this whole saga, characters that are unforgettable to any of us, no matter which media, in which media, or from which media we know them from. And I'd like to make a quick ping pong with you, sir, if you allow me. I would say a character name, and you will pop up any words, just one word, to any of them that comes to your mind when you hear their names. Altair.
Craggy.
Good one. That's a good one. Ezio.
Brave.
Good. Connor.
Strong.
Good one. Bayek.
Difficult.
Would you like to replace that for stubborn?
Well, okay. But you said the first word that came into my mind.
That's good. Jacob and Evie Fry.
Jacob and Evie Fry. Oh, God, what? Smooth.
Good one. And for, I would say that I have saved the best for last. But I'm right now being seen because I have forgot his name. But our beloved pirate, which word would you apply for him?
Oh, brilliant, brilliant, fabulous, the best.
Mr. Gill, thank you so much, because I hope that we from PopFun can contribute to our audience, not only here in Brazil, but throughout the world. We have friends in various places of the world, various countries, and it's an honor for us to having you here on this special night, on this special occasion, talking about Assassin's Creed and your career, which counts over 40 books up to this point. Will you stop writing any day? Do you have plans for that or no?
No. I'll stop writing when I die.
That's
Thank
great.
you very much.
Your thoughts and considerance for this very special chat that we have this night.
Well, I can only say I'm honoured, and it's been a delight to talk to you, and I hope I've contributed something to the enjoyment of your viewers and listeners, and it's been an enormous pleasure to meet you, and I hope to meet you in reality one of these days.
Thank God for that, and I hope, I have my fingers crossed, and I hope that we will, surely.
Okay, mine too.
Oh, before we finish, Mr. Gill, you have told us that you know just 2 words, but very positive words in Portuguese, which are,
Well, I said muito obrigado.
thank you very much. That's what it means. So guys, we're wrapping this one with Mr. Anton Gill. I hope that you guys like. We'll see you very soon. Till then, bye-bye.